the Curious Owl here, and today I am going to be discussing my thoughts and feelings on the audiobook for We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. This is an LGBTQ own voices novel dealing with a girl who is a lesbian, and there's a whole other layer to this story though. I would not go into this book thinking just on the LGBTQ rep that is involved, because the story has so much more to it than just that. It is a big part of the story, but I think a bigger part involves something a little different, which I will get into in a moment. I do want to place some very strong trigger warnings for this book though, for those of you who deal with depression or have been recently grieving the loss of a loved one or are still in the grieving process of losing a loved one, because this is a very heavy novel. And as someone who's lost someone themselves over the last several years, my grandfather specifically when I was 13, it's still hard for me sometimes to talk about my experience with grieving his loss, that this book sometimes made me really have to take a minute to step away and just kind of recollect my thoughts before continuing with the story. So go into that knowing with these trigger warnings, but without further ado, let's get into the actual review. After losing her grandfather, Marin decides to run away to the New York college that she is going to after high school, leaving her California life behind, including her best friend, Mabel. It is now the following December after her grandfather's passing, and Marin is still not able to really deal with the fact that her grandfather is gone, as there was a lot of things that was dug up around his death that she was not very happy with, and found out a lot of things that he had not told her about certain things, and she feels very alone, and Mabel decides to come to visit her during their Christmas break and try to bring her back home. With Mabel's appearance comes a slew of unanswered questions and things that revolve around the relationship and the reasons that Marin left, and left Mabel specifically, despite the fact that they had a very great blossoming relationship between the two of them that kind of was just left in the dust after losing her grandfather. This book splits between the present time with Mabel and Marin in New York City during Christmas time, and back to the past leading up to Marin's grandfather's death and the immediate effects after his death. This story is very short. The audiobook was only 5 hours and 30 minutes long approximately, but it packs such a huge punch for those of us that have dealt with losing loved ones, and losing loved ones very suddenly with no warning. It is so hard to get through this book sometimes because of especially the emotions that Marin discusses about losing her own grandfather. It is incredibly emotional, and it's also own voices not just for the LGBTQ rep, but own voices for losing a loved one and dealing with the depression that comes from that, as Nina LaCour herself had lost her grandfather prior to writing the story. The thing about this story is that, like I said, it doesn't just focus on an LGBTQ relationship. The majority of the story does focus on the grieving process that Marin is going through in terms of losing her grandfather, and a lot of the depressive thoughts that kind of come in as a result of losing the grandfather, and feeling like she wasn't good enough for him to stay around, and a lot of the things that I think many people who lose very close family friends or family members actually will go through. I do remember myself when I was very young, when I lost my grandfather at 13, that it was something that I did, that I wasn't good enough for him to stay. But that wasn't the case. My grandfather had just passed away due to, I think, a heart attack, and he never took care of himself in the first place. So it was very different for me to experience that, but I still remember feeling those exact feelings that Marin did when she lost her own grandfather. It was the constant self-doubt and the panic attacks that kind of came with after losing him, and not understanding kind of where to go after that. And a huge part of it for her too is that her grandfather was literally all she had. Her mother died when she was about 3 years old. Her father is completely non-existent, and all she had was her grandfather. And so to know that he was literally all she had and that he is gone now isn't even more heartbreaking to me, because at least I still had a family that I could lean on for support. I couldn't even imagine being in Marin's place, dealing with what she's dealing with. And it made a lot of sense as to some of the actions that she did after losing him, especially when it is revealed a lot of what he did, what he kept from her. And it made sense to me why she ran away, but there was so much I think that could have been done, you know, even though she was having such a hard time. She still had a lot of people that were willing to help her and support her, but she pushed them all away. And unfortunately, that's a very real thing that people go through, is when they're dealing with something like grief and depression, they don't want to let other people in. And so a lot of the actions that Marin takes makes sense, but when you're reading the book, you so wish that she wouldn't have done something like she does and get help. But you also have to understand that, being in that situation, you can't say whether or not you would not do the same thing, because it's entirely possible. It all depends on how you would act in the moment. And so I didn't want to judge Marin on any of her decisions, because I didn't know if I would have made those same decisions myself. It's very possible I wouldn't have, but I can't say that having not been in that situation myself. A huge thing to know about this book too, just based on all that I've talked about so far, is that this is not a plot-heavy book. This is very much a character-heavy book dealing with the situations that are thrown at them. So do not go into this story expecting a very plot-dense story. This is a character-dense story, and it is emotional, and it is really hard-hitting in that aspect. So go into that with that mindset, because I think if you go into it with a plot-heavy mindset, you're going to be very disappointed. I think one thing that a lot of people are going to have a problem with, considering this is supposed to be an LGBTQ own voices book, is that the relationship is there. You see it blossom, but after it starts, there's not really much information about it. It goes into kind of how the relationship first started and kind of some of the things they did, because both Mabel and Marin went to a Catholic school in California, and so they had to keep their relationship on the down low. So there wasn't really a whole lot about how the relationship blossomed after the initial get-together, and I thought that was okay. I totally understand, though, how a lot of people would be really disappointed in that, because they would go into this book thinking it's an LGBTQ book solely, nothing more than that. But I think that is one thing that a lot of readers need to go into this book knowing, is that this is not an LGBTQ heavy book. It has an LGBTQ romance amidst all of this grief content that is involved with it. So it's incredibly beautiful how the relationship builds and how it starts out, and how you see the interactions between these two prior to the grandfather's death, but it is not something that is super delved into as opposed to the grieving process that Marin goes through. It also touches on this idea of deeply loving someone, but the idea of possibly moving on, which I really enjoy, because there are so many relationships that, you distance yourselves from them for one reason or another, and you still feel all the same feelings you have for them, but realize that the relationship is just, it's not working, it's not happening, and the idea of possibly moving on, it's not seen a lot, I believe, in contemporary work, and I really enjoyed that Nina LaCour kind of brought this up, because despite the fact that Mabel and Marin love each other, there is this idea of possibly moving on that they discuss that is so incredibly important for couples to go into, especially if there has been distancing between the two, because it puts a strain on the relationship, and that strain needs to be worked through in order to understand kind of where everything is and where everyone lies within the relationship. So all in all, I ended up giving this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I truly enjoyed it, and I will be honest when I say that at first when I read this book and got through the first half of it, I wasn't thinking it was going to be a 5-star novel. When I got to the very end of the book, I was so surprised with how the story ended and how the story wrapped up, that there was something that kind of happened at the end of the story that made me bawl my eyes out. After I finished the audiobook, I needed to sit for a good long while and just process what happened, because it was a beautiful ending, and it was just so heartbreaking at the same time, because a lot of things kind of come to a head towards the end of the book, and it just makes you feel so strange, because it's like you're witnessing this person make this change in their life that you can't even imagine going through yourself unless you've been in that situation yourself. And so for me, it made me cry so much that I didn't know how to process it all. But when I finally had calmed myself down and had really thought about this story and kind of how it wrapped up and how it developed after finishing it, I was so highly impressed with such a short book that it was able to do all the things that it did and talk about all the things that it talked about in so short of a book. Like I said, a 5.5-hour audiobook with the physical copy being approximately 240 pages. I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are of We Are Okay if you have listened to it or read it yourself down in the comments below. I would love to hear your guys' opinions on it because I know that there were some people that were kind of iffy about it because they expected it to be an LGBTQ story and not really expecting to see a lot of the grief involved in it. But it was one of the things that I think I loved the most about it was the fact that it wasn't just an LGBTQ focused book. It was a grief content story dealing with someone who is also a lesbian. And I really, really enjoyed that. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments below. If you guys did enjoy this review, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.